Colorado Territory, 1875. Daybreak stretched its golden fingers across the rugged landscape of Twin Peaks, a mining town nestled between jagged mountains that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. In the soft morning light, Wyatt Oakley adjusted his hat and squinted at the horizon, wondering if this town might finally be the place where he could outrun his demons. At 25, Wyatt had the lean, powerful build of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, held a wariness that belied his youth. The light stubble on his otherwise clean-shaven jaw gave him a rugged appearance, though his handsome features were impossible to disguise. Despite his good looks, Wyatt kept to himself, adhering to a principle that had served him well through years of drifting. Attachment was a luxury a man like him could not afford. A man rides alone if he wants to stay breathing, he muttered to his horse, Cinder, as they approached the town limits. It wasn't just a saying, but the cornerstone of his existence. After watching his father's ranch hands betray him during a bloody land dispute 3 years ago, Wyatt had learned that loyalty was as rare as gold and twice as valuable. Trust got men killed out west, and he'd sworn never to depend on anyone but himself. What he wanted was simple: work for a season, earn enough to keep moving, and leave before anyone could form expectations. What he needed, though he'd never admit it even to himself, was something to fill the emptiness that grew wider with each passing mile. Twin Peaks looked like a dozen other mining towns he'd passed through, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon promising momentary respite from loneliness, and faces hardened by the unforgiving demands of frontier life. Wyatt tied Cinder to a hitching post outside the general store, planning to stock up on supplies before seeking work at one of the nearby ranches. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, and the familiar scents of leather, coffee, and tobacco greeted him. What was unfamiliar, however, was the sight that awaited him inside. A young woman standing tall at the counter, her voice clear and controlled despite the red-faced shopkeeper towering over her. "Mr. Greeley, I have paid my bill in full every month without exception. I will not accept this sudden increase simply because you learn the newspaper is now solely my responsibility." Her auburn hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, with a few stubborn tendrils framing a face that combined delicate beauty with unmistakable determination. She wore a practical blue dress with white trim, modest yet becoming on her slender frame. "Miss Bennett, be reasonable. Paper costs have gone up, and a woman running a newspaper alone is what precisely?" she challenged, her emerald eyes flashing. "Less capable of paying? Less entitled to fair prices? Or simply easier to swindle?" Wyatt froze in the doorway, instinctively wanting to retreat from this conflict that wasn't his concern. Yet something about the young woman's stance, shoulders squared, chin lifted, utterly alone in her fight, held him in place. The shopkeeper lowered his voice to a patronizing tone. "Julia, your father would have understood business realities. Without him, my father taught me that the printed word is this territory's most powerful tool for justice," she interrupted. "And my name is Miss Bennett to you." At 22, Julia Bennett possessed a composure that many twice her age would envy. But Wyatt, accustomed to reading people, noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her ledger book. This courage was costing her. "Everything all right here?" Wyatt found himself asking, surprising himself as much as the others. The shopkeeper straightened. "Nothing that concerns drifters, mister." Julia Bennett turned, assessing Wyatt with a glance that felt like it penetrated straight through his carefully constructed walls. "Actually, sir, perhaps you might be interested in knowing that the general store charges newcomers double what locals pay." She smiled sweetly at the shopkeeper. "Isn't that right, Mr. Greeley? Or shall I publish an itemized comparison in next week's edition?" Greeley's face paled. "Fine. Regular price stands for your paper order. This time." "For all times," she corrected, then gathered her receipt with dignified triumph. As she passed Wyatt, she offered a brief nod. "Welcome to Twin Peaks, stranger. Should you stay, you'll find the Twin Peaks Sentinel provides the only reliable account of local affairs. First issue is complimentary." With that, she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and ink. Wyatt completed his purchases in silence, ignoring Greeley's muttered comments about that Bennett girl and her troublemaking newspaper. Something about Julia Bennett nagged at him. Not just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the quiet ferocity with which she stood her ground. It contradicted everything his years on the frontier had taught him about survival. Later, saddled with supplies and heading toward the Rockingham Ranch where he'd heard they needed hands, Wyatt found himself pausing outside a modest building with a freshly painted sign, Twin Peaks Sentinel. Through the window, he could see Julia Bennett working at a printing press, sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in her task. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and Wyatt felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of her face, but of something in her determination that echoed his own stubborn will to survive. He tipped his hat slightly, then urged Cinder forward. Twin Peaks was just another stop on an endless road. Getting involved with local disputes, or fiery newspaper editors, was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. A week passed at the Rockingham, where Wyatt's skill with horses and quiet efficiency quickly earned him a place among the ranch hands. He avoided town when possible, focusing instead on the rhythms of ranch work that required no emotional investment. Yet each Saturday, when the latest edition of the Sentinel circulated even to the bunkhouse, he found himself scanning Julia Bennett's articles with growing interest. Her writing revealed a town more complex than it appeared. Tensions between mining interests and small farmers, corruption in the mayor's office, and most recently, a series of suspicious property sales forcing longtime residents out of their homes. She wrote with clarity and conviction, naming powerful men without flinching from potential consequences. "That Bennett girl's got more grit than sense," remarked one of the older cowboys, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Her daddy knew when to pull his punches. She just loads that paper with buckshot and fires at anything that moves." "Someone bought her press yet?" asked another hand. "Heard Hargrove offered to buy her out last month. Turned him down flat," came the reply. "Word is, won't be long before she meets with an unfortunate accident. Shame, too. Pretty little thing." Wyatt said nothing, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. The conversation only confirmed what experience had taught him. Standing alone against powerful interests was a fool's errand, and Julia Bennett was making enemies faster than she could possibly defend against. Not his problem, he reminded himself. Not his fight. 2 days later, fate intervened in the form of a broken axle on the supply wagon, forcing Wyatt into town for replacement parts. As he rode down Main Street, a commotion outside the Sentinel office drew his attention. A group of men were gathered on the boardwalk, and at their center stood Julia Bennett, clutching a stack of newspapers to her chest. Even from a distance, the tension was palpable. "Miss Bennett," a portly man in an expensive suit was saying, loud enough for his voice to carry, "I'm simply expressing concern for your safety. A lady alone in business faces certain vulnerabilities." "How thoughtful, Mayor Hargrove," Julia replied, her voice steady despite being surrounded. "Yet I noticed these concerns only arose after yesterday's article about the mining company's water contamination." "Dangerous accusations require substantial proof," said another man, tall and forbidding in a black coat. "Which the Sentinel provided, Mr. Sheffield. Water samples, doctors' reports, witness statements, all documented on page 3. She attempted to step around them, but the men shifted, effectively blocking her path. Wyatt found himself dismounting before conscious decision intervened. The rational part of him screamed warning. This was exactly the sort of entanglement he avoided. Yet his boots carried him forward regardless. "Miss Bennett," he called, approaching the group with deliberate casualness. "I believe you promised me that complimentary issue." His hand rested casually near his holster, not a threat, but a reminder. Julia's eyes widened slightly in recognition, but she recovered quickly. "Indeed I did, Mr. Oakley. Wyatt Oakley." The mayor's gaze shifted between them, calculating. "Friend of yours, Miss Bennett?" Before she could answer, Wyatt stepped closer, taking the top newspaper from her stack. "Just a reader appreciating honest journalism. Seems rare these days." "The Sentinel has many admirers," Sheffield said coldly, "though some find Miss Bennett's approach unnecessarily inflammatory." "Truth often burns those who prefer darkness," Julia replied, her chin lifting in that now familiar gesture of defiance. The standoff lingered a moment longer before Hargrove forced a laugh. "Well, we've taken enough of your time, Miss Bennett. Gentlemen." With reluctant nods, the group dispersed, though not without backward glances promising future confrontation. When they were alone, Julia released a breath that seemed to deflate her entire body. Thank you, Mr. Oakley, though I had the situation well in hand. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. 3 against 1 rarely ends well, regardless of how righteous your cause. 4 against 1 now, I suppose, she said with unexpected sharpness. Or did you imagine one gallant intervention makes you different from men who believe a woman needs rescuing from her own convictions? Her words stung more than they should have. I meant no offense. Julia's expression softened slightly. No, I apologize. That was unkind after your assistance. She straightened her shoulders. May I offer you coffee? The least I can do is explain why half the town was attempting to intimidate me on a Tuesday morning. Every instinct warned Wyatt to decline, to maintain the distance that had kept him safe for years. Yet he found himself following her into the newspaper office, a modest but organized space dominated by a printing press and walls covered with maps, notes, and previous editions. As she prepared coffee on a small stove in the corner, Julia explained her investigation into Hargrove Mining Company's purchase of water rights and subsequent contamination of local wells. They're poisoning the water, driving small farmers to sell at a fraction of their property's worth, then reselling to the railroad at enormous profit. And you printed all this. She handed him a steaming cup. Every word, with supporting evidence. My father always said, the truth may not make you friends, but it will make you free. In my experience, Miss Bennett, the truth most often makes you dead. The words came out harsher than intended. Rather than taking offense, she studied him with those penetrating green eyes. You've seen much of the world's darkness, haven't you, Mr. Oakley? The question cut too close to memories he preferred buried. Enough to know that standing alone against powerful men is rarely wise. And yet here you are, having just done exactly that on my behalf. Her smile held a quiet challenge. Wyatt set down his cup. A momentary lapse in judgment. Won't happen again. Of course not, she agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. A man determined to remain uninvolved wouldn't possibly concern himself with local newspapers or stubborn editors. Their eyes met across the small desk, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of kindred spirits despite vastly different approaches to the world. In that moment, Wyatt realized with unwelcome clarity that leaving Twin Peaks had just become considerably more complicated. Over the following weeks, Wyatt maintained his resolve to keep his distance, yet found himself riding into town with increasing frequency. He told himself it was for supplies, mail, or the occasional whiskey at the saloon. If his route happened to pass the Sentinel office, if he occasionally exchanged nods with Julia as she worked late into the evening, these were mere coincidences. What he couldn't dismiss was the growing unrest in Twin Peaks. Julia's articles continued exposing corruption, and the pushback intensified. One morning, she arrived to find her press damaged. Another day, distributors mysteriously lost the entire run of papers. Through it all, she persisted with a stubborn courage that both frustrated and fascinated Wyatt. Their paths crossed again when Wyatt delivered a message from the ranch owner to the telegraph office. As he exited, he noticed Julia across the street, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with Sheffield, the mining company's lawyer. The property was legally purchased, Sheffield was saying as Wyatt approached within earshot. The Wilsons signed the deed voluntarily. After their children fell ill from contaminated water and medical bills consumed their savings, Julia countered. Hardly what I'd call voluntary, Mr. Sheffield. Accusations of this nature constitute slander, Miss Bennett. I'd advise caution. Truth is an absolute defense against slander charges, she replied. As I'm certain you're aware. Sheffield's face darkened. Not everyone in this town shares your father's fondness for your crusades. Without his protection, a young woman in your position should consider her options carefully. Is that a threat, Mr. Sheffield? Merely friendly advice. Good day, Miss Bennett. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy before noticing Wyatt's presence. Something calculating flashed in his eyes before he continued down the boardwalk. Julia watched him go, her expression unreadable until she turned and spotted Wyatt. Mr. Oakley. Eavesdropping becomes a habit, I see. Hard to miss threats delivered in broad daylight, Wyatt replied, falling into step beside her as she began walking toward the newspaper office. That wasn't a threat, merely the continuation of a town-wide campaign to convince me that a woman has no business running a newspaper. Her voice was light, but Wyatt noticed the tension in her shoulders. "They're escalating," he observed. "First the press, then distribution problems, now direct intimidation." Julia stopped walking, studying him with surprise. "You've been paying attention." Wyatt shrugged uncomfortably. "Hard not to notice when the whole ranch discusses each edition like it's scripture." "And what do you think, Mr. Oakley?" Her question held genuine curiosity. "About my foolhardy crusade?" The sensible answer was to discourage her, to emphasize the danger she was courting. Instead, he found himself saying, "I think you might be the bravest person in this territory, Miss Bennett." "Foolhardy, yes, but brave nonetheless." A smile transformed her face, softening the determination that usually defined her features. High praise from a man who rides alone. Not praise, concern. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper understanding. "Would you walk me back to my office, Mr. Oakley? I have something to show you." Against better judgment, Wyatt followed her to the Sentinel. Inside, she unlocked a drawer and withdrew a stack of letters, spreading them across her desk. "These arrived over the past month," she explained. "From families who lost farms, miners suffering from lung disease the company denied, widows cheated out of compensation." Her fingers trailed over the pages. "For every threat I receive, there are 10 letters like these. People who had no voice until someone was willing to print the truth." Wyatt read fragments of desperate gratitude, pleas for continued coverage, offers of testimony. Each letter represented lives upended by the same forces Julia was challenging. "My father believed newspapers existed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable," she said quietly. "When he died last year, I could have sold the Sentinel. Many expected I would. Instead, I chose to continue his work." She met Wyatt's gaze directly. "We all have choices about how we face this world, Mr. Oakley. I choose not to turn away from injustice, even when standing against it means standing alone." Her words struck something deep within Wyatt, a recognition of the emptiness his chosen path had created. For years, he'd survived by avoiding attachment, by refusing to stand for anything that might require sacrifice. In Julia's unwavering commitment, he glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of strength. "You're not alone," he said, the declaration surprising him as much as her. Not entirely. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken significance. Then Julia smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "No," she agreed softly. "Perhaps not entirely." That evening, riding back to the ranch under a sky ablaze with sunset, Wyatt confronted an uncomfortable truth. Julia Bennett had begun to matter to him. Her courage challenged his carefully constructed philosophy of detachment. Her determination awakened something he'd thought long dead, the desire to stand for something beyond mere survival. The realization should have sent him packing immediately. Instead, he found himself considering how long his savings might last if he remained in Twin Peaks through winter. 2 days later, Wyatt's internal debate became moot when Sheriff Mills rode out to the Rocking M with news that froze his blood. The Sentinel office had been vandalized overnight, the press destroyed beyond repair. Miss Bennett wasn't harmed, the sheriff added quickly, seeing Wyatt's expression, though not for lack of trying. She was working late, managed to slip out the back when they broke in. Got herself to Doc Wilson's with a nasty cut on her arm, but nothing worse. "Who did it?" Wyatt demanded, already saddling Cinder. Sheriff Mills shook his head. "Nobody saw nothing, of course. Miss Bennett claims it was Hargrove's men, but without witnesses." He shrugged. "Some folks think she's brought this on herself, stirring up trouble with those articles." Wyatt barely heard the rest, spurring Cinder toward town with a singular focus. He found Julia at the doctor's house, her left arm bandaged, but her spirit unbroken as she paced the parlor, dictating notes to the doctor's wife. "Must emphasize that destruction of the press constitutes not merely property damage, but an attack on free speech itself. Please add that while the Sentinel's physical operations are temporarily suspended, the truth cannot be." She stopped abruptly upon seeing Wyatt. "Mr. Oakley." The sheriff works quickly. "Are you all right?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, eyes scanning for injuries beyond the bandaged arm. "Entirely," she assured him, though the shadows beneath her eyes suggested otherwise. "Though my press fared less well." Mrs. Wilson excused herself discreetly, leaving them alone in the parlor. "What happened?" Wyatt asked, fighting the unfamiliar surge of protective anger coursing through him. Julia recounted the attack with journalistic precision. 3 men breaking in while she worked, her narrow escape through the back window, the sound of metal being smashed as she fled. They were thorough, she concluded grimly. The press is destroyed, types scattered, even my father's desk hacked to pieces. You could have been killed, Wyatt said, the words rough with emotion he couldn't disguise. Yes. She met his gaze steadily. That was rather the point of the exercise, I believe. To silence the sentinel permanently. And now I must find a way to publish regardless. The railroad land acquisition vote is next week, and people must know what they're truly surrendering. Her determination was unchanged, but Wyatt noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her bandage. Julia, he said, using her given name for the first time, these men won't stop. Next time, there's always a next time, Wyatt, she interrupted softly. For those who choose to fight rather than flee. I suspect you understand that better than most. The quiet challenge in her words struck home. He had been fleeing for years, from connection, from standing his ground, from anything that required him to risk the vulnerability that came with caring. Before he could respond, the door opened and Mayor Hargrove himself entered, his face a mask of practiced concern. Miss Bennett, what a shocking incident. I came as soon as I heard. Julia's expression cooled instantly. How kind, considering your men were responsible. A serious accusation without proof, Hargrove replied smoothly. In fact, I've come to offer assistance. The town council agrees this lawlessness cannot stand, regardless of provocations. We're prepared to compensate you for your damaged property and provide funds for your return to Boston, where I believe you have family. The offer's true nature was unmistakable, a bribe disguised as generosity, with banishment as its condition. How extraordinarily thoughtful, Julia said with dangerous politeness. However, Twin Peaks is my home, and the Sentinel will continue publication. Hargrove's smile tightened. Without a press? Without financial backing? Be reasonable, Miss Bennett. Your father's crusade was admirable, but ultimately futile. Some ventures are simply too large to oppose. Like stealing an entire town's future, she challenged. Progress, Miss Bennett. Inevitable and necessary. Hargrove turned his attention to Wyatt, assessing him with calculating eyes. Your friend seems concerned for your welfare. Perhaps he might help you see reason where others have failed. Wyatt straightened to his full height. Miss Bennett's reasoning seems sound to me. The Sentinel serves this town well. A drifter's opinion holds little weight here, Hargrove dismissed him. Miss Bennett, my offer stands until tomorrow noon. After that, he left the threat unspoken, bowing slightly before departing. When the door closed, Julia released a shaky breath. Well, that was unambiguous. You need to leave town, Wyatt said, the words wrenched from some protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. Just until things cool down. I could take you to Denver, or... Running is precisely what they want, she interrupted. The vote is in 6 days. If I leave now, Hargrove wins, the railroad gets its land grab, and dozens of families lose everything. If you stay, you might lose your life, Wyatt countered, moving closer. Julia, please. I've seen what men like Hargrove do to those who stand in their way. Something in his tone made her study him carefully. You've faced such men before. It wasn't a question, but Wyatt answered anyway, words spilling out after years of silence. My father owned a cattle ranch in Texas. When the railroad wanted his water rights, he refused to sell. I watched hired guns murder him and 2 ranch hands before burning our house with my mother inside. The memories he'd kept buried rushed back with painful clarity. I was 22. I killed 2 of them before the rest ran. Then I ran too, and I've been running ever since. Julia's eyes filled with compassion. She reached out, her fingers lightly touching his arm. I'm so sorry, Wyatt. That's why I know what these men are capable of, he continued urgently. They don't stop at threats or property damage. They'll kill you without hesitation if you continue to stand in their way. And if everyone who recognizes injustice chooses safety over standing against it, what then? She asked softly. Does evil simply win by default? The question hung between them, challenging the foundation of Wyatt's existence for the past 3 years. Before he could answer, Doc Wilson entered to check Julia's bandages, and the moment passed. That night, Wyatt sat alone in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and turning over the day's events in his mind. Julia's words echoed, undermining the philosophy that had guided him since his parents' murder. Had his solitary existence been not wisdom, but cowardice disguised as self-preservation? Hear about the Bennett girl? A miner's voice carried from a nearby table. Hargrove offered her money to leave town. Should have taken it, his companion replied. That railroad's coming whether folks like it or not. Smart money gets out ahead of the flood. Shame about the press, though? Mean business, smashing up a lady's property. She ain't exactly a lady, running that paper like a man, stirring up trouble. Wyatt's grip tightened on his glass, but he maintained his silence, listening as the conversation continued around him. Heard Sheffield hired some gunmen from Denver, arriving on tomorrow's stage. For what? Press is already busted. Insurance, I reckon. Make sure she takes Hargrove's offer to leave, or doesn't live to refuse it. The casual speculation sent ice through Wyatt's veins. He left his whiskey unfinished, stepping into the cool night air with newfound clarity. 3 years of drifting, of avoiding attachment, had left him hollow, a man surviving but not living. Julia Bennett, despite the danger surrounding her, was fully alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. The realization crystallized his next steps with perfect certainty. Dawn found Wyatt at the ruins of the Sentinel office, surveying the destruction by early light. The vandals had been thorough. The press lay in twisted metal pieces, types scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers, furniture splintered beyond repair. Yet amid the chaos, he spotted something the attackers had missed. A small hand press tucked under fallen shelving in the corner, dented but intact. By the time Julia arrived, he had cleared a workspace and was examining the small press. She stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on her face. Wyatt, what are you doing? Seeing what can be salvaged, he replied, glancing up. This hand press seems workable. Not efficient for a full newspaper run, but enough for a single sheet edition, maybe. Julia crossed to his side, running her fingers over the press with something like reverence. This was my father's first press. I learned to set type on it as a child. She looked at him with questioning eyes. Why are you here, Wyatt? For once, the truth came easily. Because some things are worth standing for. And some people shouldn't have to stand alone. Her expression softened. Even if standing means risking everything. Especially then, he replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I've spent 3 years running from who I could be, Julia. I'm tired of it. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken potential. Then Julia smiled, a slow, radiant expression that transformed her face. Well then, Mr. Oakley, how much do you know about setting type? Nothing whatsoever, he admitted with a slight smile. But I'm a quick study. Over the next 4 days, the small office became their fortress. Julia taught Wyatt the basics of typesetting while they salvaged what they could from the wreckage. Word of their efforts spread through town, bringing unexpected allies. The blacksmith offered tools. The schoolteacher volunteered her students to distribute papers. Families brought food and supplies. By the 4th evening, they had produced a single-sheet special edition detailing Hargrove's scheme with painstaking precision. Contaminated water sources, fraudulent land assessments, secret agreements with railroad executives, all meticulously documented with evidence Julia had wisely stored at home rather than the office. We'll distribute at first light, Julia said, surveying their work with exhausted satisfaction. The day before the vote. Enough time for people to read, but not enough for Hargrove to organize a response. Wyatt nodded, acutely aware of the risk they were taking. Sheffield's hired guns had indeed arrived on the stage, their presence a barely disguised threat as they patrolled the streets. The sheriff maintained a conspicuous neutrality that amounted to tacit approval of whatever might happen. You should stay at Doc Wilson's tonight, he suggested, concern evident in his voice. They'll be watching this place. Julia shook her head. I won't be driven from my home by fear. She hesitated, then added softly, but I wouldn't object to company on the walk there. The walk to Julia's small house near the church was quiet, the town seemingly holding its breath before the confrontation everyone sensed was coming. At her doorstep, Wyatt found himself reluctant to leave, the protective instinct that had awakened in him growing stronger by the hour. I could keep watch, he offered. Sleep in the chair by the door. Julia studied him in the fading light, her expression thoughtful. We've come to a strange place, haven't we, Wyatt Oakley? From strangers to allies in less than a month. Strange indeed, he agreed, conscious of how completely his worldview had shifted since meeting her. Perhaps more than allies, she said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek with gentle fingers. I've watched you these past days, helping, protecting, standing beside me without attempting to stand in my place. Few men understand the difference. Wyatt covered her hand with his own, the simple contact sending warmth through his chest. You've taught me much about courage, Julia Bennett. The kind that persists even when standing alone. No one should have to stand alone, she whispered, echoing his earlier words. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that deepened into something that felt remarkably like coming home after years of wandering. When they parted, Julia's eyes held a mixture of wonder and resolve. Stay, she said simply. Not just tonight. After this is over. Stay in Twin Peaks. The request contained all the questions neither had voiced, about future, about commitment, about the possibility of building something lasting from the connection that had sparked between them. Yes, Wyatt answered, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. If we survive tomorrow, I'll stay. She laughed softly. Such romance, Mr. Oakley. I'm still learning, he admitted with a smile. But I'm a quick study, remember? Their second kiss held promise of all they might become to each other, given time and chance. Dawn broke with a clarity that seemed to mock the tension gripping Twin Peaks. Wyatt and Julia distributed the special edition to waiting volunteers, who scattered through town like leaves on the wind. By mid-morning, Hargrove's scheme was the only topic of conversation. In shops, on street corners, in the saloon where miners gathered to debate the revelations. Wyatt maintained a watchful presence near Julia throughout the morning as she spoke with townspeople, answering questions and providing additional details omitted from the crowded single sheet. The groundswell of anger toward Hargrove grew palpably with each hour, particularly among farmers whose land would be devalued by the planned railroad route. By noon, Sheffield and his hired guns appeared on Main Street, moving purposefully toward the remnants of the Sentinel office where Julia was speaking with a group of concerned citizens. Miss Bennett, Sheffield called as they approached. A word, if you please. The crowd parted reluctantly, revealing Julia standing straight-backed beside Wyatt. I believe I've said all I need to say in today's edition, Mr. Sheffield, she replied calmly. Unless you've come to offer corrections to our reporting? Sheffield's smile didn't reach his eyes. Rather, I've come to address libel concerns. These accusations against respectable businessmen cannot go unanswered. Truth is its own defense, as I've mentioned before, Julia countered. So you claim. Yet these documents you cite, mining reports, water testing, secret agreements. Where might they be examined by interested parties? Sheffield's tone suggested he already knew the answer. Julia hesitated fractionally. The evidence was secured in her home, but revealing that location would put it at risk of theft or destruction before the vote. The originals are safe, she said carefully. Copies have been sent to the territorial governor and newspapers in Denver and Colorado Springs. The truth will reach far beyond Twin Peaks, Mr. Sheffield, regardless of what happens here today. It was a bluff. The documents remained solely in Twin Peaks, but Sheffield's momentary uncertainty suggested it had landed effectively. A prudent precaution, Sheffield recovered quickly. However, local matters should be settled locally. Mayor Hargrove requests your presence at his office to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. Wyatt stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Julia. Any discussion can happen right here, in public view. One of Sheffield's hired guns moved his coat back, revealing a holstered revolver. This ain't your concern, Cowboy. Actually, Wyatt replied evenly, it is. The tension crackled between them, the street falling silent as townspeople recognized the dangerous shift in atmosphere. Sheffield assessed the growing crowd, clearly calculating whether forcing the issue would serve his purposes. Very well, he conceded with false geniality. A public discussion, then. Tomorrow, after the town council vote. I'm certain the citizens of Twin Peaks will have made their feelings clear by then. The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. As Sheffield and his men withdrew, whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. Wyatt turned to Julia, concern evident in his expression. They're planning something. That retreat was too easy. Julia nodded, her face pale but determined. The evidence. They'll try to get the documents before the vote. We need to move them, Wyatt said urgently. Somewhere they won't expect. As darkness fell, Wyatt and Julia carefully transferred the precious documents from her home to the church, where Reverend Simmons had offered sanctuary in his private office. The night passed in tense vigilance, Wyatt keeping watch while Julia finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled in the Reverend's armchair. Near midnight, the sound Wyatt had been dreading finally came, the distant crash of breaking glass from the direction of Julia's home. Sheffield's men, as predicted, searching for evidence they wouldn't find. He watched Julia sleeping, her face peaceful despite the danger surrounding them, and recognized the transformation that had occurred within himself. The man who had arrived in Twin Peaks believing that survival meant avoiding attachment now understood that some connections were worth any risk. In Julia Bennett, he had found not just a cause worth fighting for, but a future worth building. Morning brought the reckoning they had anticipated. The town council meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the town hall, but by 9, the street outside was filled with citizens carrying copies of the Sentinel's special edition. Farmers and shopkeepers, miners and teachers, all gathered in numbers that clearly surprised Hargrove when he arrived with Sheffield and their armed escorts. Julia moved through the crowd, Wyatt at her side, speaking with quiet confidence to those who still had questions about the railroad plan. Her bandaged arm and the visible bruise on her temple from the office attack had become badges of her determination, earning respect even from those who had previously dismissed her as merely the Bennett girl. When the town hall doors opened, the crowd surged forward, filling every available space. Hargrove took his position at the front with obvious discomfort, facing an audience far larger and more informed than he had anticipated. Citizens of Twin Peaks, he began, his usual bombastic confidence notably subdued. We gather today to vote on a matter of great importance to our town's future, the proposed agreement with Western Pacific Railroad that will bring prosperity and progress to our community. At what cost? Called a voice from the crowd. Poison water? Stolen land? Hargrove's face reddened. These allegations in the so-called newspaper are exaggerated and lack context. The railroad's presence will bring jobs, increased property values. For who? Interrupted another voice. Not for the farmers whose land you've devalued with contaminated water. The meeting descended into chaos as citizens pressed forward with specific questions drawn directly from Julia's reporting. Where was the money from previous land sales? Why had water testing been suppressed? Who would compensate families forced to relocate? Hargrove, overwhelmed by the barrage, looked to Sheffield for assistance. The lawyer stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. Friends and neighbors, Sheffield began smoothly. These are complex matters that deserve thoughtful consideration. Perhaps we should postpone today's vote until emotions have cooled and facts can be properly evaluated. The facts are already clear. Julia's voice rang out as she moved to the front of the room, Wyatt close behind her. Mr. Sheffield hopes to delay because delay serves his client's interests. Every day without a decision is another day to pressure landowners, another day to hide evidence. She reached into her satchel, withdrawing a stack of documents. These are the original reports, water testing showing deliberate contamination, property assessments artificially lowered, secret agreements between Hargrove Mining and Western Pacific revealing the true plan. Not a railroad that serves Twin Peaks, but one that exploits it, leaving a ghost town in its wake once the mineral rights are exhausted. Murmurs swept through the crowd as Julia handed the documents to the town clerk. I propose an immediate vote, as scheduled. The citizens of Twin Peaks deserve to decide their own fate based on truth, not manipulation. Hargrove's face contorted with fury. This is outrageous. Miss Bennett has no standing to propose anything in this council. I second her proposal, called Reverend Simmons from the audience. As a property owner and citizen of 10 years standing. As do I, added Doc Wilson, rising from his seat. Let's vote now, with full knowledge of what we're truly deciding. Sheffield leaned close to Hargrove, whispering urgently, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The council members, reading the mood of the room, moved swiftly to a vote. Within minutes, the railroad agreement was rejected by an overwhelming margin, with only Hargrove himself voting in favor. As the meeting disbanded, The atmosphere in the town hall transformed from tension to celebration. Farmers clapped each other on the back, miners shook hands with shopkeepers, and Julia found herself surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and apologies for not standing with her sooner. Through it all, Wyatt remained at her side, a quiet presence that anchored her amid the swirl of activity. When they finally stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, he took her hand, a public declaration of his place beside her. "We did it," she said, wonder in her voice. "They actually listened." "You made them listen," Wyatt corrected. "You gave them truth when it would have been easier to give them comfortable lies." Julia squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "We gave them truth. I couldn't have done this alone, Wyatt." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted at the end of the street. Hargrove emerged from the town hall, his face a mask of thwarted rage as he confronted Sheffield. "You promised this would be handled," he shouted, heedless of the watching crowd. "I paid for results, not excuses." Sheffield attempted to quiet him, but Hargrove was beyond caution. "Those documents were supposed to be destroyed. The girl was supposed to be gone. What am I paying you for?" His words, clearly audible across the quiet street, confirmed everything Julia had published. Sheriff Mills, who had maintained studied neutrality throughout the conflict, stepped forward with newfound resolve. "Mayor Hargrove," he said formally, "I believe we need to discuss these statements at my office." "This is absurd." Hargrove sputtered. "You work for me, Mills." "I work for Twin Peaks," the sheriff corrected, "and it seems I've been remiss in my duties." He gestured to his deputies. "Please escort the mayor and Mr. Sheffield to the jail. We have some questions about vandalism, assault, and apparently conspiracy." As Hargrove and Sheffield were led away, their protests fading into the distance, Julia turned to Wyatt with a smile that contained equal parts triumph and disbelief. "Is it really over?" she asked. Wyatt drew her closer, mindful of her injured arm. "This battle, perhaps. But men like Hargrove don't surrender easily. There will be others. And will you be here when they come?" The question held all her hopes and fears about their future. Wyatt looked into her eyes, seeing the strength and determination that had first drawn him to her, now joined by something softer. Vulnerability freely offered rather than hidden away. "I told you I'd stay if we survived," he reminded her gently. "I'm a man of my word, Julia Bennett." "Good," she replied, rising on tiptoes to brush her lips against his. "Because the Sentinel needs a new press manager, and I happen to know someone with experience." Wyatt laughed, the sound unfamiliar but welcome after years of guarded solitude. "I've set type for exactly 4 days. That hardly qualifies as experience." "You've stood against powerful men to protect what's right," Julia countered. "That's the only qualification that matters to me." 6 months later, as spring softened the Colorado landscape, Julia stood in the doorway of the rebuilt Sentinel office, watching Wyatt adjust the newly arrived printing press. The newspaper had flourished in the aftermath of Hargrove's arrest, its circulation growing beyond Twin Peaks to neighboring communities seeking honest reporting on territorial affairs. "Perfect timing," she called as Wyatt straightened, wiping ink from his hands. "First edition on the new press should be ready for our wedding announcement next week." He crossed to her, drawing her into an embrace that still sent warmth cascading through her. "Are you certain you want to share front-page space with mining regulations and territorial politics?" "Absolutely," she assured him. "The personal and political have always been intertwined for the Sentinel." She traced the lines of his face, marveling at the transformation from the guarded drifter who had entered her store 8 months earlier. "Besides, it's quite the story. The cowboy who watched a stubborn editor stand against an entire town and quietly stood beside her until she noticed he was there." "Until we stood together," Wyatt corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And we'll continue to, through whatever comes next." Outside, Twin Peaks bustled with afternoon activity, a town finding its way forward with newfound transparency and purpose. Inside the Sentinel office, Julia Bennett and Wyatt Oakley had discovered what both had once thought impossible: that even in the harsh realities of the frontier, two souls determined to stand for truth could find not just purpose, but a love strong enough to face whatever battles lay ahead, together.